I supposed to go ahead now?
Yes.
Okay. That's a yes. Okay, well, welcome to this session. I regret that we can't all see each other face to face. There are many old and new friends that I would wish to be talking to in the hallways, but this is what we have. And I want to start by just expressing gratitude to the people who did the hard work of organizing this conference. And I won't name them by name, but you know who you are, and we're all tremendously grateful to you for organizing this. So it's my, I'm very excited to introduce one of the world's most effective thinkers and activists in the struggle against global neoliberalism or hyper-globalization or market fundamentalism or whatever you want to call it. And Pettifor was a co-founder of the Jubilee 2000 movement that campaigned for cancellation of third world debt with considerable success. And unlike the scholars assembled at the London School of Economics who could not answer the Queen's question, she anticipated the 2008-2009 global financial crisis in her 2003 book, The Real World Economic Outlook. She was also prescient as part of a group that called for a Green New Deal as early as July of 2008. And obviously that makes a strong link to the previous session which ended with the discussion of the Green New Deal. In 2017, she published The Production of Money, and in 2009, The Case for a Green New Deal. Her Polanyi credentials include a long friendship with Carrie Polanyi Levitt and the fact that her organization, Prime, was first to make available Polanyi's Bennington lectures from 1940 that had been lost for many years. Her talk today will address the question, can societies challenge and transform the state's role in creating, resourcing, and protecting today's capital markets? So let's welcome her with an enthusiastic but imaginary round of applause. Anne.
Hi, great. Thank you so much for that introduction. And like you, I'd like to thank the organizers, Marguerite Mendel and Anna Gomez, who've been so patient with me, and for the hard work of this organization. But special thanks goes to my dear friend, Karl Polanyi Levitt, for the honor of this invitation to deliver a keynote in the company of very distinguished scholars, which I found quite intimidating. How wonderful it is to know, Kari, that you continue to be the catalyst bringing together profound and radical congregations of economists and social scientists to discuss the most important issues of the day and Karl Polanyi's continued impact on those issues. We at Prime are particularly indebted to Kari and also to Bennington College for permission to publish and make widely available Karl Polanyi's 5-lecture series delivered to the young women at Bennington College in 1940. Thank you also to Fred Block. If I may also just add this point to my bio, my interest in the international system has its origins in a life growing up under apartheid in a small gold reef town in the Orange Free State of South Africa, where gold had been discovered in 1947. There as a schoolgirl, on long journeys with my dad, who'd missed out on education to go to war, I struggled to understand the system he described as Bretton Woods, a system in which central banks pooled their efforts to fix and hold the price of gold at $35 an ounce from 1934 until 1971. So while I was growing up, all other prices in my town rose or fluctuated, but gold that was extracted at some considerable risk from some of the deepest gold mines in the world by both black and white mine workers remained fixed at just $35 an ounce. That system sounded pretty unfair to me, and thus began my lifelong preoccupation with the international financial architecture. So Karl Polanyi's Bennington lectures are fascinating for the insight they're given to Polanyi's thinking as he worked on what was to become his masterpiece, The Great Transformation. The first 3 lectures in the briefest of forms effectively summarize some of the main themes of his longer work. But the last 2 of the 5 lectures cover slightly different ground from that which he finally included. The 4th poses the question, is America an exception? In which he asks whether at a time when President Roosevelt's New Deal was still in place, can democracy indeed exercise control over the power of finance capital? A question that has relevance to still today. And notably, this point he makes: it would be too early, he says, to say whether America has already achieved a plastic society, i.e. a society which can be shaped by the political state and other conscious social factors without danger of a fatal stoppage. If so, this would be mainly due to the absence of the control of the financial market over the credit of the state itself. The conflict of White House and Wall Street in the first years of the New Deal, in conjunction with the dropping of the gold standard, may have had greater importance, he writes, than it is usually credited with. While I want to applaud Robert Kuttner's excellent and uplifting keynote to this conference, while I want to agree that with the Biden administration we are in a historic moment, an inflection point, my question remains: is the Biden administration willing to prevent financial markets, more particularly Wall Street, from controlling the credit of the state and, in effect, the economic policy direction of the United States? And if so, can the Biden administration do so? I believe that it can, and I will try and explain why in this presentation. But first, I want to position Bidenomics, as it's being called, in the bleaker and wider economic and ecological picture of the global economy. Robert's comments about the different paths currently taken by Europe and the US brought to mind the different paths taken by the United States and Europe in the 1930s. The United States, under President Roosevelt, chose democracy. Europe, under the leaders of far-right parties, chose fascism. Secondly, under Roosevelt, and largely thanks to Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, a new, more cooperative and coordinated international financial system was built after the Second World War, one that diverged radically from the divisive, unbalanced, and obscenely unequal and nationalistic system of the Ricardian gold standard, replicated today in the system we call globalization. So Roosevelt and Keynes' internationalism was, as Jeff Tiley has argued, an internationalism of labor, one that involved, as he writes, a paradox. Policy was aimed at increased domestic demand, motivating activity internally rather than externally. By contrast, the 19th century gold standard, like today's globalization, represents the internationalism of wealth, of the 1%. It is an inherently unstable system prone to crises, and as Klein and Pettifor have argued, where domestic demand is repressed, fostering a race to the bottom synonymous with overproduction, bracket relative to the limited purchasing power subduing demand, high private debt, speculative excess, and financialization. So as I view this moment from the perspective of Brexit Britain and question whether the Biden moment is transformational, I have to mention an event that exploded on our news bulletins late last Sunday night. The announcement of the launch of a new cartel, the European Football Super League, which I choose to showcase here because the event has today shot Polanyi into the stratosphere of social media. The establishment of the Super League cartel was to be financed by Wall Street's JP Morgan Chase, a bank that pops up several times in my review of the last century, with a, quote, $3.5 billion debt financing deal amortized over 23 years against future broadcasting rights, a deal offered already to heavily indebted football clubs and by bankers who, to quote Roosevelt, faced by the failure of credit, have proposed only the lending of more money. This was just the latest outright attack by Wall Street on the people's game, English football. As Professor Mark Blythe of Brown University argues in a Substat article today, it was a plan that was bound to fail for several reasons, but most importantly, because there was just no conception that what is actually a private asset in the hand of an investor is a public asset in the hands of the community simultaneously. They completely forgot that. And on this popular football site, Professor Blythe remarks that, and I quote, and forgive the crudeness of the language, Karl Polanyi, the Hungarian sociologist and historian from the 1940s, wrote that the big fuck-ups of the 19th and 20th century were attempts to shove markets down people's throats to the point where they revolted. So while I am cheered by Robert Kuttner's assessment of the Biden administration, I must protest that it is not Rooseveltian. It is not yet about system change. Wall Street is still backed up by the United States judiciary and regulatory system to ride roughshod over the regulatory systems of other jurisdictions. To achieve a transformation on the scale achieved in 1933 alone requires an escape from Wall Street's globalized carbon-belching financial system, designed and engineered to issue trillions of dollars of largely unregulated credit to fund supposedly limitless consumption and production, and in turn to furiously fuel toxic emissions and generate mountains of debt. Roosevelt was about system change. He was about removing Wall Street from the driving seat of the economy and placing a democratically elected government in the driving seat of the American and ultimately the international economy. Governments, I should have said. In the words of his Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, we moved the financial capital from London and Wall Street right to my desk at the Treasury. Until Biden moves the financial capital that is Wall Street right to Janet Yellen's desk at the Treasury, we conclude that Wall Street will remain in the driving seat of the economy. And that matters because we are now living through a new dangerously unbalanced era of accelerating ecological breakdown, a breakdown which threatens the life support systems on which human civilization depends. If societies are to tackle the grave crises of economic failure and ecological collapse, restoration of public democratic authority over the international system is central to that vital task. By restoring public authority over the international system, societies in Europe, Africa, and the United States can hope to restore both ecological and economic stability, but also public faith in democratic regulatory institutions. I want to argue that the possibility of transformation is entirely viable, is entirely possible by reviewing the 20th century quickly and reviewing the shifting power relationships. As Polanyi noted in 1940, earlier in the 20th century, financial capitalism in the 19th century form of globalization suffered several major setbacks. And this was in part a result of the monetary theory, actions and policies of John Maynard Keynes, President Roosevelt, their supporters and voters. To begin, I want to re-examine events that took place at and after the Versailles peace negotiations in Paris in 1919, events that, in my view, are still relevant and have been wrongly interpreted and understood by historians, notably Margaret Macmillan and Adam Tooze. The Versailles peace negotiations represented a Herculean struggle over monetary theory and policy between the young economist John Maynard Keynes and a man dubbed by his grandson as the ambassador from Wall Street, Thomas Lamont, advisor to America's President Wilson. Keynes was a capitalist and was acutely aware of the dangers posed to capitalism in 1919. He set about producing a simple but nevertheless revolutionary plan for the rehabilitation of Europe. And I have Professor Eric Rawchway to thank for the detail of what was achieved at Versailles, which has often escaped other historians. Given the absence of formal and rigorous public accounting systems, his was a back-of-an-envelope plan refined by constantly checking and amending his understanding of the assets and liabilities of the German and Allied economies. Getting the numbers right was important. However, more important was Keynes's reconceptualization of the world's economic and financial structure. His scheme for the rehabilitation of European credit and for financing relief and reconstruction proposed a new international financial order based not on the gold standard, but on the economic activity and public authority of states. It was a plan that would have financed recovery in Europe, permitted policy autonomy to domestic economies, and enable officials and politicians to respond to democratic mandates. It set out to restore stability and prosperity to national economies within a sound, stable, and very necessary international framework. That insight alone was profound, that a national economy could be helped to recover from a cataclysmic world war by the deliberate actions and policies of a cooperative international financial system. For Europe to recover, he argued, its economies required a stable international system to help countries attain full employment, etc. The revolutionary element of Keynes's scheme was that it replaced a system governed by private authority of unaccountable financial markets, effectively JP Morgan, with one governed by the public authority of democratically accountable governments. His cunning plan can be briefly summarized as follows, and here I must acknowledge the rigorous research undertaken by Eric Rouchway. Germany would issue bonds to the present value of £1 billion and to a face value of 1.2 billion, bonds that would pay interest of 4%. These bonds would be guaranteed jointly and severally by the, quote, principal allied and associated governments, by the 3 Scandinavian governments and by the governments of Holland and Switzerland. These were the strongest economies of the world, represented by the 4 leaders at Versailles. The bonds issued under the scheme would have priority over all other German obligations, whatever. And this was the point that really upset Wall Street. Allied guarantees would make the bonds attractive to capital markets, so that the prostrate Reich, as he called it, could raise the finance needed to pay most of what was owed to the Allies in reparations and debt. Keynes's plan was even more ambitious. It evolved into a strategy for the transformation of the post-war international financial system. The bonds issued by Germany would be accepted at par value, plus accrued interest in payment of all indebtedness between any of the Allied and associated governments, but would have a second, more important purpose. They would become an international financial asset, accepted as payment between Allied governments and as first-class collateral at central banks. In other words, they could act as a form of intergovernmental money, backed not by gold, but by economic activity within and between Allied nations. The Germans could use the bonds to raise finance and convert the purchasing power into finance for reconstruction. The French could use the bonds to pay debts to the British, and the British could use them to pay debts to the Americans. His concern was not for individual nations or nationalisms, but for Europe, and I quote, "The good faith of the world as a whole is pledged for the carrying out of a scheme, the sole object of which is to set on its feet the new Europe." His scheme was to be rejected effectively by the narrow nationalisms of President Wilson, Prime Minister Lloyd George, and by France's Georges Clemenceau. In his opposition to Keynes, Wilson was aided by the money interest, or as J.P. Morgan's biographer Ron Chernow describes it, Yankee Wall Street. In his opposition to Keynes, Wilson was aided by the money interest. Yankee Wall Street was present at Versailles in part because the First World War had been a, quote, bonanza for the street, Chernow explains. The biggest foreign loan in Wall Street history, a $500 million Anglo-French loan, 5 times as big as the previous record holder, the $100 million loan to Great Britain for the Boer War, had been syndicated in 1915 by J.P. Morgan. No surprise then that J.P. Morgan was not just present at Versailles, but according to one of the bank's competitors, Bernard Baruch of Kuhn-Loeb Bank, J.P. Morgan and Company was, quote, running the show. Unbeknown to Keynes, but recently revealed by Rouchway, Wilson's letter of rejection was drafted not by the president, but by J.P. Morgan's Thomas Lamont. So Franklin D. Roosevelt was 12 years later, was state governor of New York in 1929 and oversaw the fallout and impact on unemployment of the Wall Street crash, the 5,000 banks that went bust. 14 years after the Versailles Conference ended, and by now the President of the United States, Roosevelt pivoted away from the economic orthodoxy of the gold standard imposed by his predecessor, President Hoover. Instead, he purposefully adopted the monetary approach first outlined in Keynes's grand scheme for the rehabilitation of European credit. So convinced was Roosevelt by Keynes's monetary theory that on the night of his inauguration, he began dismantling what Fred Bloch has called the fantastic machinery of the gold standard. His staff told him that he couldn't close the banks on the Sunday because it was a holy day. He'd have to wait till Monday. In the first weeks of the administration, Rouchway notes, while Keynes's newspaper columns circulated amongst the Roosevelt group, the banker and confidant of Roosevelt, James Warburg, grumbled that Keynes provided scientific backing, if Keynes can be called scientific, for Roosevelt's policies. I quote, "The adoption of Keynes's approach proved spectacularly successful for the newly elected president. As he later reminded others, the bank holiday, quote, was an emergency measure, but it was also the first of the steps in transferring to the federal government the more effective control and regulation of the monetary system, including monetary gold, and restricting the private profits of a privileged few out of the government's action." Roosevelt was forced to defend his decision before an unsympathetic Supreme Court in 1935. He submitted evidence on his reasons for withdrawing from the gold standard, the effect of deflation, its impact on debtors, and noted the recovery underway. He also predicted mass bankruptcies and the resurgence of both America First, proto-fascists, and elements that were more radical. Fortunately, the court voted by just 5-4 to uphold his policy decisions. If the court had restored the gold standard, would, as Rawchway notes, and I quote, "have undone the administration's measures to prop up the banks and undercut the fragile recovery, inducing widespread defaults and ruin. As it was, the court left Roosevelt's dollar intact while dismantling much else. With politics preventing the adoption of an adequate public works plan and the justices striking down price-fixing policies, the dollar policy became ever more important as the major remaining tool for recovery." So in partial answer to the question posed as my theme, yes, the United States government can, with political will, restore public authority over the financial system, or to be more specific, Wall Street. It has been done before, and it can be done again. However, how is this extraordinary transformation to be achieved today in this modern world? That task of subordinating the private finance sector to the interests of domestic economies appears insurmountable given the power and detachment of the sector from the regulatory framework of states. However, the first of many steps that must be taken is to harness the latent power of the population to spread public understanding, something dear to my heart. People cannot act to transform that which they do not understand. The mainstream economics profession ensures that much about the international financial system is deliberately clouded and obscured in language designed to protect private markets from public scrutiny. Instead, the public are encouraged to focus on the nation, the firm, and the individual, the microeconomy. That must change, and a broader understanding of the international financial order explained to young girls like me back in the Orange Free State, right? Perhaps the most important understanding should be that tax-paying citizens in prosperous economies have immense potential power. An understanding that Keynes used when he proposed to use that power to revive not just the devastated European economy, but also the global economy. Millions of honest, law-abiding taxpayers may not be aware, but they act to both uphold the private globalized financial system and provide public services. They do so by regularly paying taxes. The certainty and predictability of tax revenues in OECD economies means that issues of sovereign bonds are used by the finance sector as safe collateral for borrowing and speculation. Government treasuries and central banks help to expand, guarantee, and de-risk the activities of the globalized financial private sector. A recent interview by a Goldman Sachs executive throws light on Wall Street's dependence on the public debt of the United States, or US treasuries, as they're called. Mr. R. Martin Chavez explained to Bloomberg that treasuries are, quote, are the beating heart of the global financial system, the core of the private financial system. He went on to express concern about a possible cyber attack on US treasuries. He says it keeps him awake at night. 99% of those promises to pay, and that is all that they are, exist purely in electronic form in an Excel file somewhere in the Federal Reserve. And as he explained, there's just a computer somewhere that's keeping track of who owns them. And if someone could get into that record and cause us to lose confidence in who owns the treasuries, that would be, he says, it's so hard to even think about that outcome. It would be so extreme and so dire. Public borrowing or public debt is not only of great value in mobilizing resources for tackling climate change, creating good jobs and essential infrastructure, it is also of immense importance to the private, globalized shadow banking sector in generating income and leveraging additional finance. To Wall Street and the City of London, the safe public debt of Britain, Europe, and the US is a truly awesome and even phenomenal gift. Shadow banks, based on the theory of money as real exchange instead of as social technology or as a social construct, shadow banks operate by reverting to making temporary loans of cash in exchange for collateral, an exchange known as a repurchase agreement or repo. As Professor Daniela Gabor has argued, the US and European repo markets, the largest in the world, and they far outstrip the old traditional banking sector, are built on the most valuable collateral, government debt. The state, as she writes, has become a collateral factory for the shadow banking sector. Until societies fully grasp the value of this collateral, of public debt to the finance sector, then we will lack the ability to leverage power over immensely wealthy, globalized corporations and individuals like JP Morgan Chase, Amazon, or Facebook. If we turn a blind eye to the value they attach to our public assets, if we refuse to insist on terms and conditions for the use of those public assets, then they will continue to parasitically extract rent from public assets, and societies will become ever more powerless in the face of that accumulation and greed. To reiterate, taxpayers have agency over global financial markets. Around the world, they subsidize, embolden, and enrich centers of financial power like Wall Street, Frankfurt, Tokyo, and the City of London. And this was made very clear by the bank bailouts after the 2008 crisis. Publicly backed central banks, backed by taxpayers, deployed their immense financial might and bailed out the globalized financial system, stemming a cascade of debt deleveraging that could have contracted the money supply, credit, and economic activity and deepened the crisis further. Thanks to taxpayers, central bankers were able to use this power to avoid another Great Depression. It was a great power deployed in the name of citizens, but without their authority or even their knowledge. This power lies in abeyance, suppressed by the dominant moneyed class and by many in the mainstream economics profession, suppressed also by the narrow myopic view that we and our politicians have of the potential economic power of citizens. And while I worry about the rise of far-right parties in Europe and the possibility of Mrs. Le Pen and her rebranded Front National winning the next presidential election in France, recent developments in Europe provide hope, as Laszlo Andor has just explained in the previous session, for the necessary transformation. Just over 100 years after Keynes produced his grand scheme in October 2020, the European Union, after extensive debate and argument, issued a joint plan to fund economic recovery across the Union from the coronavirus pandemic. Given the neoliberal nature of the Eurozone, it was an implausible initiative by countries worst hit by the coronavirus pandemic, Italy and Spain. The then Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte and Spanish MP Pedro Sanchez made a proposal for a European Commission-backed corona bonds in April 2020. At an extraordinary and historic meeting on the 21st of July 2020, European leaders overcame the resistance of Hayekian-influenced economists and agreed to the creation of the temporary recovery instrument known as Next Generation EU. What was unprecedented about the instrument was that it crossed previous red lines, which had prevented the more prosperous countries from using their economic power to mobilize finance for the weaker EU nations. The decision to jointly both issue and back EU common debt and central transfers echoed a central tenet of Keynes's grand scheme. It would enable the bloc of EU states to use their collective power to raise finance to alleviate the social and economic consequences of the pandemic across the Union. As in the case of the proposed 1919 bonds, the decision granted the EU preferred creditor status, with debt repayment to the EU taking priority over funds owed to Wall Street, the City of London, and other private creditors. This proposal required the issue of joint public debt at the EU level, creating a solidarity mechanism for the redistribution of debt between the European states. As the European Commission explains, this initiative is part of a concerted European response, which includes safety nets for workers and so on, which Laszlo explained. So I am hopeful that this is a moment in history, an inflection point, as Robert Kuttner argues. I remain hopeful, even though, as with Polanyi, I would argue that Wall Street still has effective control over the credit of the state itself, and that no, America is not yet a plastic society which can be shaped by the political state and other conscious social factors without the danger of a fatal stoppage. Above all, it is not yet a society which can consciously tackle the gravest threat to ever confront human civilization: climate breakdown and biodiversity collapse. Thank you. Oh dear.
Oh, well, thank you, Anne. That was very rich and provocative. So we do have some questions here, and so I'll just read the first one. That we don't know who this comes from, but they ask, is it fair to claim that FDR and also Polanyi in a similar way was about system change when what he did was put safeguards in place to allow capitalism to continue to flourish without challenging the fundamental structures of capitalism? And what do the long-term effects of these limited safeguards as a response to runaway capitalism tell us about what is necessary today?
Well, I think I tried to explain that in my speech. Of course, both Roosevelt and Keynes were capitalists, and both, as someone said yesterday, helped to maintain the capitalist system. They saved capitalism from capitalism. But I find that argument unhelpful, because what it does is dismiss the changes and the transformations that happened. What it does is to dismiss the fact that millions of jobs were created in the 1930s. What it does is to dismiss the fact that the United States didn't respond to Hearst's America First campaign and commit to fascism. These are kind of pretty big political achievements. And they were to be attacked and undermined by Wall Street consistently throughout, right? So, when you see what the powers were against him, even so, and I think it's arrogant to dismiss the high levels of employment, the removal of the threat of fascism, and also the fact that Roosevelt was able to finance a huge ecological crisis in the United States, the Dust Bowl. So if you want to dismiss all these and say that all it did was restore capitalism, fine, but it's not something that I'm prepared to do.
Well, to say nothing of the fact that it took 30 to 40 years before the neoliberals could regain the political offensive and begin to demolish what the New Deal had accomplished. So, so the next question, which is also anonymous, was that asks about shadow banking, drives up the demand for government bonds, and this demand supports monetary policy transmission channels via the repo market. Thus, central banks also rely on shadow banking. You suggested that public power be exercised via conditions around sovereign debt issue. How do you see this being affected by the two-way nature of the relationship between governments and shadow banking?
Well, I think the central banks have both created the market in the repo markets and they sustain them. And they do it so very consciously. And do they do it with public authority? Does the public know that this is what they're doing? Most economists don't understand or know what's happening in the shadow banking sector. That's the point of it. This is genuinely Quinn Slobodian's encased market sector. It's encased, it's blocked off, it's out there. Nobody knows what they're doing or what is happening. But the central banks do know, central bank governors, the officials at central banks, who are, our technocrats, our servants, our public servants, our civil servants, are, allowed this market to develop. And yes, they use it for the transmission of monetary policy, but they didn't have to. There are other ways of managing monetary policy, and they have refused to do so. They've accepted the marketization of finance, basically, they've accepted that we won't have regulated banks anymore, but we'll just have financial markets, and financial markets will provide all the finance that the global economy needs, and especially financial markets that are beyond the reach of regulatory democracy. So in this sense, central bank governors are culpable, and the public, and in particular economists, by not ensuring the public understands what's going on, are also culpable. I find the economics profession really guilty on this point, because they turn a blind eye to what's happening, and they get very, very offended that we call it the shadow banking sector. The FSA, I think it's called the Financial Stability Board, FSB, insists we call it some kind of intermediation thing, and they want to rename it as not the shadow, but it's a shadow banking sector, and it's much, much bigger, and it includes companies like BlackRock that are now being put in charge by Mr. Biden and John Kerry of the climate transformation. I mean, so I think we have a problem with our public servants that have allowed the market to rip, if you like, let rip in this way, and that there's going to be a cost when things go wrong in that market, when the valuation of that collateral changes. We know many economists explain that the global financial crisis of 2007-9 was caused by a change in the valuation of collateral used in the shadow banking sector, particularly as those were mortgage securities. And that change in the valuation of the collateral, exploded the debt that had been leveraged against that and caused the global financial crisis. But again, that's still pretty much a state secret. I mean, I know plenty of economists who blame people buying houses for the 2007-9 crisis. They say the housing market was the problem. No, the shadow banking market was the problem. And I can't accept that central banks need it for the transmission of policy. They certainly don't.
Let me come back to the Kuttner question that you began with, and that what would be the indications that the Biden administration was actually beginning to engage in what you would call transformational change. I mean, one instance is that we know that the Biden administration changed the policy. The Trump administration had been resisting the IMF's mobilizing the special drawing rights to help the rest of the world deal with COVID. That seems to be a move very much in the spirit of Keynes. I mean, since the special drawing rights are the heirs to the International Credit Union. But what else? I mean, what kinds of specific policies would you see as indicating some kind of break? And obviously, the complexity here is that with the extremely narrow congressional majority that they have, that the strategy is very much to try to win the midterm election, gain some more seats, and then embark on something more substantial, in much the same way that the 1934 election paved the way for the New Deal's most dramatic domestic measures, the National Labor Relations Act and the Social Security Act.
Sure. I want to say that it's really presumptuous of me to suggest that this is easy. It's not going to be easy. And I completely accept what Robert says about the narrow majority and the need to win the next congressional elections. And I'm completely on side on that one. And, so it's very different from the 1930s. But what is also different is that Roosevelt campaigned on Wall Street. And Roosevelt, in his inaugural speech, was really devastatingly critical of Wall Street. So there was a recognition that Wall Street was part of the problem. And that hasn't come through in this administration, although for me, I'm clear that part of the revolt that there has been against globalization is actually a revolt against Wall Street, essentially. And yet many politicians haven't, the politicians that have picked up on that have been on the right, on the far right, often, Trump. while at the same time, by the way, colluding with Wall Street. But there's lots of contradictions in there, but it's a revolt against globalization. The left has a big problem. The left thinks globalization might be a good thing because we can travel to exotic countries, we can use credit cards and debit cards around the world. This is a great thing to be welcomed. And if you look at what is happening to the Social Democrats in Germany today, there's an opinion poll out which shows that they trail the Greens, they trail the Christian Democrats, they trail the Liberals. They have the smallest percentage of support there is. And that's because social democracy across Europe and in Britain has for too long colluded with Wall Street. All of British, most of the Labour Party's leaders, with Gordon Brown the exception, here in Britain, have joined JP Morgan. Yesterday, Chuka Umunna MP was announced as a new employee. Tony Blair works for them. And the public are not stupid. The public understand that this political collusion with Wall Street, with the finance sector, with globalization, is something that's hurting them, that's hurting the majority. And yet politicians haven't picked up on it. I wrote a book called The Case for the Green New Deal, in which I argued the reason why we need to shadow the New Deal is because precisely that in order to tackle a climate crisis, Roosevelt understood that he had to tackle Wall Street, the financial system, because he had to mobilize the resources for that, right? That understanding is not present in the American Green New Deal. It's not discussed by the Democrats. And I understand why. Wall Street is powerful. It is wicked and bad and can be very difficult politically. But the public want to know that you understand that the 1% are ripping us all off, that this is a globalization of the 1%. This is the globalization of wealth, not the globalization of labor. The public understand that, not enough politicians do. So that's a rather roundabout answer. But I want to say straight away that I don't want to be too critical, because I think the challenge, and Biden has been extraordinary and is being extraordinary. And I absolutely commend the courage in just ignoring the Republicans and going ahead and finding that his policies are immensely popular and the Republicans are in disarray. Now, that is political acuity and strategic sense, which is, must be applauded, as Robert does.
So we have a question from Roy Culpepper. He wants to know, what is your view of Mark Carney's argument in his recent book, Values, Building a Better World for All, that a transformation of the financial sector to embrace social values is necessary and is in fact underway, as in his announcement of a net zero financial alliance with 70 trillion in assets under management to confront the climate emergencies?
Mark Carney has been on a trajectory, and I very much endorse his values. As I haven't read his book, but he delivered the Reith Lectures this year, which is based on his book. And he's also had some wonderfully innovative ideas for central banking. He also understands central bankers are under threat and have to change their tune. He at his last speech at the gathering of central bankers in the United States, he proposed a scheme for replacing the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And I really like that and think it's really, well, it doesn't matter whether I like it or not, but I really commend it.
Well, I think we're having some technical difficulty here with Anne's Zoom connection.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Fred. I don't know. Just imagine I'm in the middle of London. I'm in central London, and my Wi-Fi's let us down.
Oh, not your fault, but yeah. So
no, sorry. So, and I've lost my train of thought, I'm afraid. I was rambling, I thought.
Well, you were addressing this Mark Carney question and saying that you admire his values, but I presume you were about to go on to say that the private financial institutions
can't lead this thing. They can play a role, but they can't play a leadership role. And unfortunately, John Kerry has announced at the press conference at which his first press conference, that not only were the markets going to be part of this, they were going to lead this. And Gina McCarthy said the same. And I think that's not plausible.
Right. Although I think they're saying that those things in part because that they're the politically expedient things to say. I mean, that it's clear that the kind of central preoccupation of the Biden people is to drive the wedge between the Trumpist Republicans and the business community, and that they've been very effective in driving that wedge, and
that's
want to keep doing it. Which I guess let's see if I guess Margie's asking the question as to whether Mark Carney is beginning to challenge Mariana Mazzucato. I mean, is there some movement in that direction from?
I'm not conscious of that. I think he's taking this time to think more and to write more. But no, I'm afraid I can't comment on that. I haven't noticed that.
So let me ask kind of the one more issue. I mean that just autobiographically. I mean, when I started working on Bretton Woods, in the 70s after the closing of the gold window, what was most striking was that nobody knew anything about the international monetary system, and that there were this small guild of international economists, who produced essays for Princeton, and they had a monopoly, but they were like 30 people, and that hardly anybody else in the world had an understanding. Which kind of goes back to the point that even at the time that Roosevelt went off gold and began the trajectory that you talked about, there was very little public understanding of the importance of this, of the centrality of the gold standard as an international constraint. So I guess what I'm trying to formulate a question is kind of for change to be transformational, how much public understanding of the power of Wall Street, the power of global finance, the need for the state to direct the financial system. I mean, how central is public consciousness to the process of transformation?
So, I think I'm going to contradict myself here, because I think public education on the subject is terribly important. But I also was listening to the earlier session in which, I'm sorry, I've forgotten her name, the woman on the session with Laszlo,
Right.
in which she argued that really, people participating in democratic decision-making, I hope I'm not misrepresenting her, because they have short-term interests, can sometimes distort outcomes. What's really much more important is accountability of those policymakers and politicians who are in charge. So, and in a sense, the public doesn't need to know the detail and the complexity of monetary policy and theory. But the public, in my view, perfectly well understands the forces at play. If you look at Brexit, I don't think politicians understood how much Brexit was about. Hang on, we're sick and tired of the 1% telling us what to do. We want to take control back over that global economy out there. That's not fixing us. That's not creating our jobs. That's taking our jobs, right? And we know this is going on. We don't know exactly how or why, but we're mad as hell, right? and we're going to kick everyone in the butt that is in favor of it. And this was what got the Labour Party into a terrible muddle about it all. So I think I think we never underestimate the intelligence of the public and their awareness of what's really happening without them having to have detailed monetary theory understanding. But the crime is the fact that the economics profession doesn't pay enough attention to the international system and doesn't talk about it enough. I mean, I'm battling here in Britain to get the Labour movement, the Labour Party, to talk about the international system. They don't think they need to, because somehow it's a natural system within which what's really important is what British policy making is. And no, it isn't. British policy making is determined by the system. If we want to raise tax revenues here, it's really hard to do because the international system gives permission to Amazon, Facebook, JP Morgan to shift their money out tomorrow, right? So when, for example, the European Commission decided they wanted to get, I think it was, am I right, was it Google to pay $13 billion in unpaid taxes? Google went to the courts and the courts said, sorry, it's the law that Google should be able to move its money abroad into a tax haven like Ireland. That's the law. And you commission, and the public know there's something fundamentally wrong about that. Even so, the degree of understanding for me isn't the issue. That is to be amongst the specialists, the economists, the people whose responsibility this is. And that includes central bankers. I'm stunned by sometimes the comments made by central bankers and how little they seem to understand the system. So I think that's where the duty lies. And as the earlier speaker was arguing, those people have to be held accountable by the public without the public having to be, the experts in it.
So we have another question here from Tanya Massacot. She asked, do you think that by announcing capital gains tax hikes as well as general wealth tax hike, directing the conversation of the population on that problem would already be a good starting point from the Biden administration in putting this problem and condoning it as a problem for the social mentality to change?
Absolutely. I'm thrilled. I mean, that was announced. We only heard about it properly today. And I think tackling capital gains tax is an understanding of where people are making their money. They're making capital gains out of assets which are pre-existing and they're not making profits out of investing into new infrastructure or into new assets. They're making capital gains out of existing assets. And that's the rentier economy. That's what's so problematic about the economy today. So I'm thrilled by that. And yes, I imagine this is going to really incur the wrath of Wall Street because capital gains is where they make all their money. I have arguments with my Marxist friends. We shouldn't talk about profits anymore. Nobody bothers to make profits. Nobody bothers to engage with land or with labor in order to make profits. Everyone speculates on existing assets like London property or works of art or racehorses on which to extract future rent streams, and taxing that seems to me, really important if we want to end inequality. So I'm thrilled by that. Mm.
As well as the moves on the international corporate taxation, the establishing.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Janet Yellen's proposal, excellent. Yeah. And that's going to be so revealing of what's happening in different countries that are going to object to it and not play ball. But this is where the United States can use its power, and I really do. I'm behind them on this, very much so.
So I guess Margie is asking for you to talk a little bit more about in your conception of the Green New Deal, what that would mean in terms of constraining and limiting the role of the financial sector as it is now.
So the point of it, I mean, for me, the really important policy point is, and so far, and that's what's so useful about the Polanyi quote, the really important point is the credit of the state, right? And the credit of the state is subject to the rate of interest. And Keynes had proposals, his liquidity preference theory, for managing the rate of interest across the spectrum of lending and borrowing. if the management of the rate of the credit of the state is in the hands of Wall Street, and the government wants to raise finance to tackle climate breakdown, large sums of finance, Wall Street can choose to aim, to raise the price of that credit, to increase interest rates, to refuse to pay the yield on the bond set by the central bank. And I expect Wall Street is currently chafing at the bit. They want to do that, right? Because, of course, they're not making the capital gains they can make from credit under these low rates. And in any case, by the way, rates beyond market rates are not low. Let's be clear that bank rates, central bank rates are low, but market rates are not low. And I think that is the point at which it becomes extremely difficult for a government that needs to raise and mobilize the finance to tackle, pandemics or climate breakdown. And that is, for me, the big, big pinch point. And Keynes was very clear that governments, central banks had to manage that process, mainly because, like me and you, he was against usury. The ability of banks to use credit created out of thin air, essentially, a social construct, a promise to pay, to put a price on that and to put a very heavy price on that, which requires the extraction of assets from labor on the one hand and the ecosystem on the other to finance the returns on that credit, and the whole of our wealth inequality is based on interest rates. If you understand interest rates as the return to wealth, high rates of interest increase the rate of return to wealth. Those who own assets, for those of us who don't own assets, we don't have that kind. We have wages, and wages don't generate that rate of return, and yet that rate of return is not in the hands of regulatory democracy. It's in the hands of Wall Street.
Okay, well, that's perfect. We have to end here. We're running out of time. So I want to thank you for an excellent presentation and an extremely rich question and answer session. And it's been a great pleasure to meet you after all this time and to hear you speak. And thank you to everybody. And we'll see you at the coming sessions. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you.